1 finger out of 10. A phrase, a formula, generally deployed by Chairman Mao Zedong when dismissing setbacks as minor compared to the gains. 1 loss, 9 wins. 1 finger out of 10. I'm going to read to you the details of a report compiled in March 1961. It was an investigation into the aftermath of what we might now consider to be one of the worst human disasters in history, and the predominant subject matter of this episode, a period of Chinese history known as the Great Leap Forward. This report I'll read to you from details what had happened in the region surrounding a small city in central China, Ningxia. As the historian Frank Dicotta, whose work I'm quoting this from suggests, the details are comprehensively arranged in the kind of list which favours those responsible for planning this human disaster, in what he describes as reducing horror to a mere set of facts and figures. You can imagine these items I'm about to read being listed in columns of a table. Quote, date of incident, 25th February. Location, Hongtai Commune. Name of culprit, Yang Zongcheng. Status, poor farmer. Number of people involved, 1. Name of victim, Yang Ershun. Relationship with culprit, younger brother. Manner of crime, killed and eaten. Reason, livelihood issues. The report goes on. Date of incident, left blank. Location, left blank. Name of culprit, Ma Manai. Status, poor farmer. Number of people involved, entire family of 4. Name of victim, blank. Relationship with culprit, blank. Number of people involved, 13. Manner of crime, corpses exhumed and eaten. Reason, livelihood issues. Date of incident, January 9th, 1960. Maiji Commune, Zhang Sama Village. Name of culprit, Kang Gamai. Status, poor farmer. Name of victim, Maha Maiji. Fellow villager. Number of people involved, 1. Manner of crime, hacked to death, cooked and eaten. Reason, livelihood issues. These are just 3 of the 50 or so cases of cannibalism and necrophagy that were detailed in the report. This was just one city, not even in a big region, and it occurred over just 2 years. 2 years in which more than 54,000 people died in Ningxia, predominantly of starvation. A state of being that will push humans into a different kind of mentality, something most of us will never have any understanding of. A place where we are so desperate that we might dig up the bodies of the dead. Or worse, kill another person just to sustain our own survival. Creating a system that causes starvation, or planning and implementing an idea or project that has that effect, whatever it may be, on purpose or not, it doesn't really matter, does it? What I care about and what always moves me to such an extent, and it is something that has affected me deeply in my study of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge regime, it's always struck me that at any point of time in which populations are subjected to this, put in this kind of position, it might be a long siege of a city or something of that nature, where massive starvation and the effects it has on humans takes hold. That is just about the base of what we can do to ourselves and each other. It is the lowest our species goes in some way. I'm sure we've all played hypothetical games with each other. Hey, would you rather be eaten by a shark or buried alive? Would you rather freeze to death or go down in a plane crash? What is the rule of thumb that's going to guide your answers there? What is the kind of thing we're all going to ask for? Something quick and painless, right? Well, starving to death, in my mind, is the worst way to die. all of the agony, the physical pain that we all dread, the drawn-out torture of it, again, something we all pray we will never experience. But it's more than that. It's all the things that happened to you before you started to starve. It's watching those closest to you die. It's having to do things that you never thought you would, just to get a scrap of something even closely resembling sustenance. It's making choices that might haunt you for the rest of your days, however short or long they may be. It is pure suffering. Well, morbid as it may be, I guess some of us do tend to think about these things, these ways of dying, and when you read about something like the Great Leap Forward, the sheer scale of it all, the worst kinds of misery, the things that people had to do to survive, this is an event in history where, well, the numbers are naturally disputed and different totals enumerated, but, it seems strange to say when a number gets so large that you're adding or subtracting tens of millions from it. But perhaps 30 to 45 million people died. Maybe more, maybe less. But let's take that number, no matter how unconscionable it is. 45 million. That's a number that we will not ever truly be able to consider in our mammalian brain. It can't be. And neither can the suffering that those numbers scream out. And in this example, we are talking about numbers that sit quite comfortably in between the total number of people who died in World War I and the total number of people who died in World War II. Somewhere between 20 million in the first and 75 million in the second. But those, of course, were wars. Wars, as their name implies, fought with industrial weapons, bombs, ammunitions, and on a global scale. They were world wars. But not only is the Great Leap Forward not a war, it won't even really occur during wartime, although those who planned it and put it into action did use the population of China as a kind of army, and indeed there will be a tremendous amount of violence against their own population, but the vast majority will suffer and die because they simply did not have enough food to eat. Famine occurs in nature. Famine occurs in human history. Sometimes it's nature which conspires against us, but sadly, sometimes it's our own plans and ideas which lead us toward famine. And this is the worst one that has ever occurred. Hello everyone. Welcome back to In the Shadows of Utopia. Continuing here with Season 2, and as you can guess from the title, we are going to be exploring the non-Cambodian events of history that will have a big influence on Cambodian history in this episode. So if you're new to the show and asking yourself why a Cambodian history podcast is spending an hour or so on events in China and the Chinese relationship with the Soviet Union, well, perhaps I should just briefly reiterate that this whole series is an attempt to give you a very well-rounded explanation of the Khmer Rouge Revolution within the context of Cambodian history and relevant global history as well. This episode is in some ways the third and final part on the origins of communism we did earlier in the series, which looked at the context in which this theory of history came to be. Part 1 covered Marx and Engels' ideas, how they came about, their applicability, while Part 2 explored what Lenin brought to that ideology, and how it came to be the foundation of a new country, eventually led by Stalin. To give an example as to why these things are important to the story, Pol Pot explained in a speech to the world in 1976 a speech prompted by the death of Mao Zedong, I should add, that his country, Democratic Kampuchea, was run by a Marxist-Leninist organization that he was the leader of, the Communist Party of Kampuchea. So if you don't know what Marxism-Leninism means, you're missing out on quite a bit of the explanation for why the Khmer Rouge did what they did. And aside from the eulogizing nature of his speech for Mao Zedong, we can also get a pretty large clue as to why the ideology of Maoism was important to the Cambodian communists through looking at one of their most widely used slogans during their time in power. With the revolutionary organization, we shall make a great leap forward. A super great leap forward. So, again, to have a good sense of explaining how and why things happened in the Khmer Rouge Revolution, a working understanding of these concepts is extremely important. Otherwise, you might end up simply mystifying the terrible actions of their regime as the irrational work of bloodthirsty psychopaths, rather than men and women who were well aware of what they were doing and the purpose for doing so, which in my opinion makes it even more terrifying. But this episode won't just be about the ideological framework that the Communist Party of Kampuchea would go on to emulate in significant ways, but also the relevant historical circumstances that will complicate the Second Indochina War and lead to the Third. I'm of course referring to what is known as the Sino-Soviet Split, and we will spend some time understanding its origins as well. It's probably worth saying as well that just like the discussion of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and Stalin, I should point out that I'm not an expert in Chinese history, and we will not be doing, a 100-year deep dive into China prior to the declaration of the People's Republic of China under Mao in 1949. We're only going to cover about 10 years of history, the lead up to the Great Leap Forward, the tragedy that ensued, and then outline the circumstances that led to the relationship between the two great communist powers becoming less camaraderie and more of a rivalry. And before we get into it, as always, I want to thank those of you who have supported the show in any way, whether leaving a review or rating on iTunes or wherever you might be listening, and especially to those who have contributed financially via PayPal or Patreon. Please visit the website for more information about all of those kinds of things. And to those of you who are listening to this relatively soon after it's come out, apologies for the wait. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about China. On the 1st of October, 1949, Mao Zedong formally announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. Just prior to this momentous occasion, he had proclaimed at a meeting that, quote, "The Chinese people, comprising 1/4 of humanity, have now stood up. The Chinese have always been a great, courageous, and industrious nation. It is only in modern times that they have fallen behind. Today we have closed ranks and defeated both domestic and foreign aggressors. Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation." End quote. There is quite a lot for us to get out of those words, especially if we just want to briefly contextualize the moment in which the communist victory in China occurs, and what that means for the Chinese people. But let's take that first sentence. The Chinese people have stood up. We've discussed other sorts of political movements throughout this series so far, and that kind of sentiment does not strike us as particularly unique, does it? These ideas of awakening, as we saw in the Cambodian nationalist movement, for instance. The difference being, and with no offence intended to the Cambodians from our story, but China is on a slightly different scale, isn't it? As Mao kind of alludes to there, That landmass contains a significant portion of the world's population. We might also be reminded of some of the attitudes that the West and the rest of Asia generally have held to China in the past. This mighty civilization and heavy influence on the region itself, but also recognized by someone like Napoleon in the early 1800s as a potentially huge influence on the global stage. He is said to have described China as a sleeping giant, and when it woke, it would move the world. Well, a little over 200 years later, and after years of relative mediocrity, instability, foreign invasion, revolutionary movements, foreign occupation and civil war, well, a new China had been proclaimed. In Mao's words, the Chinese people had stood up. And I think if we look at the history of the world since, it's probably fair to say that Napoleon wasn't far off in his assessment about what they would be able to do either. China had been on a long journey toward this reawakening. An important year in this process was 1912, when the Manchu dynasty crumbled and gave way to years of civil war and foreign invasion. Eventually, the most notable domestic rivalries will be between the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and the Communists. The most significant foreign group will be Imperial Japan, whose actions we briefly discussed in the context of the Second World War a few episodes ago, but their ambitions in the region were felt horribly, savagely in mainland China prior to that generally acknowledged beginning of World War II. The invasion by Imperial Japan forced the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao into a united front of resistance. In the 8 years that China is occupied, which lasts until the end of the Second World War and the defeat of Japan heralded by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, well, the communists had grown stronger during this time, and generally speaking, the nationalists had grown weaker. With Japan no longer in the picture, the United Front no longer remained united, and a final showdown between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek loomed. Now, while all of this was going on, there were some interested parties in the rest of the world, particularly as this is a time when the global stage is beginning to take shape in the wake of the Second World War. Notably, how the two clear remaining superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, were envisioning the balance of power and what we could see as the early shape of the Cold War system. Again, generally speaking, we can see how the Chinese communists would have been looking toward the Soviets for support, and likewise the nationalists are looking at the United States. And this is, generally, how it went. However, support from both sides was somewhat limited. Stalin was always a little uneasy with his Chinese comrades, and they would go on to win the war without significant assistance from the Soviets. And likewise, the US, while pouring military and economic aid into the nationalists for a time, well, they weren't overly impressed with the workings of the Kuomintang, and that tap is turned off before the conflict is over as well. The nationalists were commonly plagued by corruption and financial mismanagement, squandering the support of the urban Chinese, while the communists, underdogs to begin with, had won the loyalty of the country's poor peasantry, and followed a set of strict behavioural guidelines that painted them as a disciplined political movement that would not exploit local farmers or steal food and supplies, something that goes a long way during a civil war. As the war unfolds, the nationalists suffer a series of defeats, and the communists gain strength in both territory and numbers. By 1948, nationalist armies began defecting in their droves, while China's major cities fell to the communists. Then, as we saw, by 1949, victory became a certainty and culminated in the designation of Beijing as the new capital and the proclamation of the People's Republic of China in October. Beijing was adorned with large portraits of Mao, and amongst a jubilant atmosphere and military parades, civilians chanted, "Long live Chairman Mao," A long, long life to Chairman Mao, while he called back over a loudspeaker system, "Long live the People's Republic." There was a spectacular fireworks display, and the chairman emphasized his point that the Chinese people had stood up. But were they truly ready to stand up? Professor of Chinese history Richard Baum suggests that, yes, while the Chinese Communist Party, which we will predominantly refer to as the CCP from here on out, well, yeah, they'd basically come from nothing and relied on ideology and resourcefulness to win the Civil War. But that still doesn't really change the fact that China itself, well, had been ravaged by wars, by foreign occupation, by decades of instability, and a badly damaged economy. If the communist victory in 1949 represented the Chinese people standing up, well, they were badly beaten and bruised in the process. They could use some support. It is perhaps illustrative of where the Chinese people stood that the Soviet Union became the first country to recognize the new communist state, and even as some rubble still smouldered in the wake of the Civil War, Mao was already preparing for his first visit abroad, naturally, to Moscow. So that is, a painfully brief overview of how China gets to that point in 1950, where there is a new government, there are no foreign occupations. Basically, China is whole again, even if the nationalists do manage to have their holdout on the island of Taiwan. But we're not going to go through all of this, context-heavy narrative format like the rest of the series. What I really wanted to do was just establish a few things before we look at how this new communist country takes shape. Importantly, like in the Soviet case, and the Vietnamese case, and eventually in the Cambodian case as well, these communist revolutionaries are coming to power on the heels of war, and they are more or less used to working in wartime conditions, and looking at things in terms of war, which we will see. But that is a little separate to the ideological side of things, which we might frame in terms of this new gospel in the communist doctrine that Mao represents, what is often called his Sinification of Marxism, Leninism. Sino meaning China, by the way, which will be handy for you to know, my dear listener, when I keep saying Sino-Soviet Split by the end of the episode. But I am getting ahead of myself. Or am I? I mean, it's worth sort of laying out some foreshadowing of that communist rivalry now, because the Soviets represent a necessary thing for Mao and the Chinese communists to lean on. Like I said, has China stood up? Definitely. But right now they could use someone to help hold them up. As I kind of alluded to before, though, it's not as if the Soviets and the CCP had been the best of buddies. Throughout the Civil War, for instance, there had been some assistance, but it had not been unconditional, and Stalin had been slightly, let's say, patronizing of the Chinese movement, potentially in that realist sense, that it's not exactly desirable to have a massive new and powerful country on your border, whether they were ideologically similar or not. This is exemplified when Mao does come to visit Moscow in the wake of declaring the People's Republic of China, looking to solidify the ties between the two. And it is far from a straightforward affair between leaders. Various stalemates about terms and conditions result in Stalin not seeing Mao for weeks. A kind of battle of wills ensues, and the brinkmanship between them gets super real. I'll just quote from Philip Short's biography of Mao to give you an idea. Quote, "For the next 2 weeks, the talks were suspended. Mao was left to stew in the ponderous elegance of Stalin's personal dacha, in a birch forest a few miles west of Moscow. On December 21, he attended ceremonies marking the Soviet leader's 70th birthday, where he was seated next to Stalin and made an appropriately flattering speech. But this was a purely formal occasion, and the Russians then abruptly cancelled talks which had been tentatively scheduled for the 23rd. Mao exploded in anger. Now he quotes Mao. "I have only 3 tasks here," he shouted at his Soviet minders, pounding the table. "The first is to eat, the second is to sleep, and the third is to shit." Yet, when Stalin telephoned him, 2 days later, Mao was evasive and refused to broach political issues. When he, in turn, telephoned Stalin, he was told the Soviet leader was out. End quote. See what I mean? Not exactly best buds. Also just a little taste there of the somewhat crude way of speaking that the chairman would often indulge in. More of that later. But in Moscow, they eventually do come to a kind of wide-ranging treaty between the two big new communist countries. This so-called Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance. But this again was a deal that really highlighted Stalin's lack of enthusiasm toward the new Chinese regime. Soviet credits for the Chinese were far less than those that had been afforded to new communist governments in Europe, and those had generally been in the form of grants, rather than loans. Loans which had to be repaid by the Chinese over 10 years with interest. Again, think of a friend of yours borrowing some money. It would be wild if you said, "Yeah, no worries, here you go, I know you're in a bit of a bad way, I know you need this, but also, let's figure out some interest on that. Yeah, I know you're in a tough spot right now, but I gotta think about my interests too, But China badly needed this assistance, and as well to present a unified communist front to the rest of the world. And very soon this alliance would come up against a test, the Korean War. Thankfully, this Cambodian history podcast is straying far enough into the weeds that I can cordon off further discussion in that direction. But suffice it to say that this engagement on the Korean peninsula is a kind of sign of things to come, and that the Cold War will have its fair share of wars. Chinese troops suffer more than 1 million casualties in this stalemate. This during a time where, as we shall see, the new People's Republic of China was not in the best position to be going to war abroad. It also says to the world watching on, especially those on the other side of the Cold War, that China and the Soviets were going to back things up with guns, just like the US would. But beneath that veneer of solidarity, and without going into too much detail, this war caused some strain on an already uneasy relationship between the Soviets and the People's Republic, which we will continue exploring toward the end of the episode. But before we return to the domestic issues, however, it's worth noting that we did cover how the Korean War came to its negotiated settlement of peace at the same conference in Geneva that had settled questions of peace in Indochina. This, of course, all somewhat precipitated by the death of Stalin in March 1953. A few of the world powers were looking to cool things down a bit, focus on their domestic issues, and the PRC, as we saw in their negotiations at Geneva, were certainly interested in basically rebuilding their own country, rather than getting further stuck into these proxy wars in Korea and Indochina, urging the North Vietnamese to come to an agreement, even if it meant they wouldn't control their entire country. We went over some of the reasons that might have worried the Chinese in and of itself, but above all else, it was a consideration of the proximity to these wars that China has, and a need to focus on matters at home. So, by 1954, those wars had reached a negotiated end, sort of. And, for the new People's Republic, they could basically set upon fully realizing their socialist agenda in China itself. So this 10 years of history in China, covering the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949 through to the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward in 1962. What that time span gives us is another example of a new communist regime looking to, in a sense, deliver on their campaign promises, if we were going to use a more modern political kind of metaphor to describe it. Basically, they had ran this campaign for many years, and that campaign had also included defending from foreign invasion and occupation, as well as civil war against their political opponents, the nationalists. But the comparison to, a presidential campaign or a political campaign where you make a lot of promises and then if you win, well, you have to deliver on those promises, right? Well, the communists have won their country. What happens next? Well, they need to consolidate that power. They need to actually take control of the country that they have proclaimed. In the wake of the communist victory, which we should remind ourselves came out of a war, the party looked to reshape and reform the country, and just as we saw in the Soviet Union after they won, or even back in the French Revolution, there was a move to delineate who the people were, who were the citizens, and who were the enemies. This involved a high degree of class-based thinking. This was a communist regime after all. But it was not just the workers and the peasants who were going to form the dictatorship of the proletariat, as it were. The Chinese economy was in a shambles, so it was necessary to also include those who we might have deemed as coming from classes that were less trustworthy in Marxist thinking. Well, how is this achieved in the early days of the People's Republic? Well, aside from genuinely targeting those who were deemed counter-revolutionaries, the completely undesirables. I mean, you'll often see figures of more than 2 million people being detained, as well as more than 700,000 people just simply being executed. Something that Mao saw as absolutely necessary. He said that if we are weak and indecisive and excessively indulgent of evil people, it will bring disaster. But there was also some very wide-ranging campaigns to simply eradicate traits of Chinese society that were decidedly antithetical to the new society they were looking to create. For instance, there was the 3 Anti campaign, which referred to anti-corruption, anti-waste, and anti-bureaucratism. Then there was the 5 Antis campaign, which was quite a lot more intense and coercive. This was designed to punish crimes of bribery, tax evasion, embezzlement, theft of state property, theft of state secrets by non-communist industrialists and businessmen as well. And there was also what is called a thought reform campaign. The idea for this thought reform campaign had originally come about in the 1940s in a place called Yan'an, where there, in a sort of communist stronghold, party members had been forced to undergo intensive group-oriented study and criticism. This was described by Richard Baum as trained cadre reading party texts, highlighting their ideas and significance before getting participants in these sessions to, speak from the heart about these themes and their reaction to it. This is something we saw back in the Leninist stuff as well, and it all has a kind of vaguely religious vibe to it, if you ask me. It's what we could generally call self-criticism, where people are expected to expose themselves and any politically incorrect behaviour or thoughts, and those they've noticed in other people too. And this was judged in this kind of group environment, and if you had successfully passed, then, well, all is all well, and you have the love of the party still. But if not, well, then you could be subjected to fairly scary punishments, including incarceration, abuse, even torture. Using these same techniques later, once they were in power, this thought reform campaign, well, it was aimed primarily at the urban intellectuals in order to enforce conformity to the new regime and to eradicate so-called bourgeois ideas. And what does this, look like in practice? Well, It means you've got a lot of neighbours informing on their neighbours, workers denouncing their bosses, even children denouncing their parents. As Philip Short writes in his biography of Mao, quote, "A climate of raw terror developed. Minor offenders, Mao declared, should be criticised and reformed, or sent to labour camps, while the worst among them should be shot." For many, the psychological pressure became unbearable. The two campaigns together took several 100,000 more lives, the great majority by suicide, while an estimated $2 billion US, a staggering sum at that time, was collected from private companies in fines for illicit activities. Surviving cadre, private businessmen, and the urban population as a whole had received a memorable lesson in the limits of communist kindness. End quote. Now, these campaigns were, as we said, countrywide, but more focused on cleaning out the urban areas in particular. If you were part of these classes of people, again, what we could in communist parlance define as the bourgeoisie, then your thinking had to be corrected if you were going to maintain a place in the new society. But different kinds of reforms also needed to take place in the rural areas as well. The communists had rode to victory in large part due to their embrace of the peasantry, as well as the promise of reforming the landlord system that had subjugated them. If we deem the reform campaigns in urban areas as, well, keeping structures in place still, like at this time there were still private companies, for the moment, but they were being cleaned out and oriented toward the new regime's plans. What goes on in the countryside is much more transformational, and will set the stage for further collectivization, and eventually private ownership being abolished. But in this early stage, it takes the shape of classifying all of the people in these rural areas. So all peasants are identified according to their class lines. Landlords, rich, middle, and poor peasants. Landlords had their property confiscated, while peasants would fall into these aforementioned categories based on their land holdings and how wealthy they were. This was, it was not a gentle process in many instances. Let's take one of Mao's most famous sayings and see how it might frame this rural land reform campaign. He wrote in his Hunan report in the late 1920s, quote, "The peasants will break through all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will, in the end, send all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local bullies, and bad gentry to their graves. A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle. A revolution is an uprising, an act of violence, whereby one class overthrows the power of another. They, who used to rank below everyone else, now rank above everybody else." End quote. There are some hints at the ideology of Mao in that quote, and we will expand upon those and a few more in a moment. But if we just kind of use that rhetoric as a background to these initial land reform campaigns in 1950, well, it shouldn't be too surprising that peasant anger frequently erupted into physical abuse as landlords were paraded before them, and the phrase here is struggled against for their past crimes. Violence would often get out of hand, and upwards of 800,000 landlords were killed in the course of the campaign. The land confiscated was given to the poorer peasants, and hey presto, you've got land reform. Now this is different from collectivization, which will happen a bit later, but it certainly has the effect of purifying the countryside of that landlord class and essentially delivering on that promise of liberating the peasants and completely reinforcing the power base of the CCP in the rural population. So we could broadly say that in the aftermath of these initial reform campaigns, aimed at just consolidating the control of the country, we have around 1.5 million deaths at the hands of the state. Again, That is just the thrust of a regime getting itself up and operational and ready for what comes next, which is a more focused socialist transformation, largely modelled on the Soviet Union and the steps they took. This really begins to take place in 1953, so a few years after the People's Republic is declared, and the regime is looking to develop toward a concerted effort toward a modern communist state. We often talk about, models and blueprints in this series for these kinds of things, and the obvious example for China was what had gone on in the Soviet Union. You'll recall these kinds of Stalinist terms like 4 or 5 year plans. And in this case, China went for a 5-year plan based on a highly centralized economic development, agricultural collectivization, and growth in heavy industries. Now, Stalin is dead by this point, but his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, takes a more supportive position toward the Chinese and offers hundreds of millions of dollars in economic and military aid, as well as sending thousands of experts to help build the infrastructure required for this 5-year plan to work. He also agrees to share perhaps the most important thing that a nation could possibly share with another, the know-how to create an atomic weapon, and perhaps even hand them a kind of prototype version of the bomb in the near future. This is also the period where previously private companies become completely nationalized, and as we sort of alluded to there, the wheels were set out in the countryside for the collectivization of agriculture as well. Now, collectivization of a huge country's agricultural output is a really important thing to take note of. We saw how this worked in the Soviet Union. Essentially a process of turning a system that had people working on private plots of land to grow enough for themselves and enough to sell into an economic system. Well, it changed from that, kind of like turning a farm into a factory. And in a command economy, that means we're saying, well, this is what's going to be grown, how much is going to be grown, when it's going to be grown, how many people are going to work on this farm, as well as how much is going to be requisitioned by the state. The Chinese example is interesting because, well, just as we went over, it was only a couple of years earlier that the new regime had liberated the poor peasants and got rid of the landlords and basically given them all these parts of land that they had always dreamed of. And now the state was back to say, hey, all of that land that we finally gave to you and now you're really happy with, well, now all of that land that you're farming on, that you're considering your own, actually that's ours, as well as the tools you've been using to farm with. That would be like if you ran a political campaign saying you were going to get rid of, if you're renting, you've got like a landlord. Getting rid of all the landlords. If you're renting a place, the election's over, now you own the place. And for 2 years, you're not paying rent, you're loving your life. This is my house now. And then after 3 years, the government says, hey, by the way, glad you're enjoying the house, except now it's our house. And also, here's 10 more people that are going to live in it. And we're going to tell you what you can do in it. And all of the things that are in the house, that's actually ours now as well. Now, collectivization doesn't just affect the farming process itself and the economics of it, but it radically impacts the farmers themselves. You go from one family working on one bit of land to a whole zone of land marked out as one farm, and hundreds, sometimes thousands of people are set to work cultivating it. But that's how things are developing in the countryside. Generally speaking, by the mid-1950s, the 5-year plan was well underway. The People's Republic had set itself up as being extremely close-knit with its primary ally in the Soviet Union, as well as setting in motion the kinds of state building that would lead them toward a functioning socialist country. The economy had been nationalized, the agricultural system largely collectivized, And if you're following that Soviet model, everything's basically going to plan. Now, another part of that model that we could quite generally include in the Soviet case would be a person like Stalin. The way he commanded a kind of cult of personality. He was the central, overwhelming figure in the Soviet Union until his death. And you might recall some of the brutal aspects of his regime. But he was still this monolithic figure. He was a hero of communism. His face went up in that, prophets of communism flag. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. Which is why a speech that was made in 1956 by Nikita Khrushchev went down in history. A speech in which Stalin's successor questioned the role of a Stalin-like figure in a Soviet model of communism. The speech was delivered to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February of 56. And it's a massive speech, but I'll read out some snippets to you to get across what the new Soviet leader was espousing. Quote, "After Stalin's death, the Central Committee began to implement a policy of explaining concisely and consistently that it is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person, to transform him into a Superman possessing supernatural characteristics, akin to those of a god. Such a man supposedly knows everything, sees everything, thinks for everyone, can do anything, is infallible in his behaviour. At present, we are concerned with a question which has immense importance for the party now and for the future, with how the cult of the person of Stalin has been gradually growing. The cult which became at a certain specific stage the source of a whole series of exceedingly serious and grave perversions of party principles, of party democracy, of revolutionary legality." End quote. Now, Khrushchev goes pretty deep in this speech. He goes on to say how Stalin was kind of antithetical to Marxism, how Lenin had said he would not be a good leader, how Stalin's methods had been exceedingly brutal, how Stalin had overestimated his military prowess, how he had become a megalomaniac. At times it almost resembles this, cutting roast of the former head of the Soviet Union. But the key point is outlined in the section I quoted directly, that a cult of personality, having a central quasi-godlike figure, that is a problem. And how does this affect the story? Well, this was the so-called secret speech. It was done in a closed session kind of thing. But a translation eventually makes its way to China, and it has a big impact. You might presume that after some of the less than amicable treatment that the new Chinese regime had received from the Man of Steel when he was still alive, that perhaps Mao would have been happy with the new Soviet leader not only giving his country millions and millions of dollars and advisors, but also denouncing the former leader that was a bit of a dick to him. But according to Philip Short, Mao had serious doubts about Khrushchev's approach. He notes a meeting between the Chinese leader and a Soviet diplomat a month later, in which Mao is more than happy to talk about Stalin's errors that have been brought up in the speech, but only those errors that related to China. He made no reference to the problems of the cult of personality generally, which had been the whole point of the secret speech. Mao told him that Stalin had been a great Marxist, a good and honest revolutionary who made mistakes, not on everything, but only on certain issues. Not long after this, an editorial in a prominent Chinese newspaper, essentially a voice of the party, also followed a similar line to Mao, emphasizing the glorious achievements that Stalin had brought about in the Soviet Union. Short goes on to say that this editorial made a few implicit points, the most important being that China would not be unquestionably following the Soviets on everything they did. and also that Mao was commenting on these events not from the standpoint of some junior partner, but as an equal. Mao had said, when proclaiming the People's Republic, that the Chinese people have stood up, and now it seemed that they didn't need anyone's help to keep standing up. What Mao was seeing as ideological mistakes in the Soviet Union also soon spilled over into policy mistakes abroad. We won't get into the details here, but in the second half of the 1950s, there are a few other countries in the Soviet bloc which go into a bit of turmoil that requires a harsh Soviet reaction, like in Hungary and Poland. And these are just tiny signs that perhaps that Iron Curtain had a few cracks in. That perhaps there wasn't going to be this relentless tide of socialist expansion emanating from the Soviet Union. Mao, in some part, sees this as a weakness of the Soviets. He told the members of the Chinese Central Committee in a meeting in November 1956 about his reflections on where the Soviets were going. This is a bit of a long quote, but I think it will do a lot of work explaining what will soon become a proper ideological split between the two communist giants. Quote, "I think there are two swords. One is Lenin and the other is Stalin. The sword of Stalin has been discarded by the Russians. We Chinese have not thrown it away. First, we protect Stalin, and second, at the same time, we criticize his mistakes. As for the sword of Lenin, has it not also been discarded to a certain extent by some Soviet leaders? In my view, it has been discarded to a considerable extent. Is the October Revolution still valid? Khrushchev's report at the 20th Congress of the CPSU says it is possible to seize state power by the parliamentary road. That is to say, it's no longer necessary for all countries to learn from the October Revolution. Once this gate is opened, by and large, Leninism is thrown away. How much capital do the Russians have? Just Lenin and Stalin. Now, they've abandoned Stalin and practically all of Lenin as well. With Lenin's feet gone, or perhaps with only his head left, or with one of his hands cut off, we, on our part, stick to studying Marxism-Leninism and learning from the October Revolution." End quote. Now, Mao, basically there, he's saying, sure, the Russians had some good stuff, some important stuff to begin with, but they're throwing it away. They don't even know what they had. They've got it wrong. We can take that good stuff and make it even better. So, on the one hand, you've got the secret speech made by Khrushchev causing a little bit of tension between the two. But those events in Poland and Hungary also have communist powers around the globe asking questions of themselves and looking at ways of making sure that similar events do not take place in their own states, looking to make sure that they can handle dissent against their rule. Now, I realize I'm getting both into the weeds as well as extremely scant on the details whilst I'm in and amongst them, and I apologize. But it's necessary to just set up a lot of this broader stuff to an extent, because it folds into the circumstances around the Sino-Soviet split as well as a brief direction change in China itself. A kind of gesture of goodwill and tolerance to the kinds of classes of people that are, let's say, marginalized in a socialist state. A suspicious class of people that we can generally name intellectuals. So there is an attempt to get ahead of what this class might represent in terms of opposition to socialist rule by encouraging a release of the steam valve. Just a bit. Seeing if there are any grievances to air. Letting this potentially influential group have their say. And hey, they shouldn't be scared to do so, right? In this moment where there seems to be a need to change direction, both in terms of just copying everything that the Soviet model carried, as well as the potential need to allow for a level of open dissatisfaction from some elements of society. Well, the Chinese regime embarks upon what is known as the 100 Flowers Campaign, which, in brief, amounts to a toleration of public dissatisfaction. A movement intended to make the party more responsive to the wishes of the people. In early 1957, cautiously at first, but then to a growing extent, many people make their thoughts of the Communist Party known. In the words of Richard Baum, some intellectuals even accuse the party of being doctrinaire, arrogant, opportunistic, and corrupt. Some go as far as to directly criticize Chairman Mao. In the words of Philip Short, quote, "The 100 Flowers was the most ambitious attempt ever undertaken in a communist country to combine a totalitarian system with democratic checks and balances. Even Mao was unsure what it would produce. Let's try it and see what it's like," he said at one point. "If we acquire a taste for it, there will be no more worries." Now Short then adds, what would happen if the party did not acquire a taste for being criticized? Well, that was left discreetly unsaid. End quote. Well, after a few weeks, and after some groups had begun openly calling for an end to communist rule in China, well, those who had been encouraged to speak their minds would begin regretting having done so. Now, historians argue over how much Mao had envisioned the 100 Flowers campaign as a trap from the beginning, or only decided to treat it as such afterwards, but the results are, well, scary. Essentially, and this was the way it was explained in a lecture on the subject I watched, it was as if you had a classroom full of 100 students or so, and the lecturer at the front of the room, he said at the start of the lesson, "Oh, hey, by the way, does anyone have any comments about the course or the teaching method so far? Seriously, if you have any criticisms, it really helps us make the lessons better, and there will be obviously no problems if you want to say something." And after a while, a few people raise their hands. Perhaps one or two say, "Yeah, actually, there are some things that could use some changing." If the lecturer then stood there, shocked that people had actually said anything that critical, and then done a complete 180 and said, "Okay, security, take those students who raised their hands out of the room. Also, everyone who said anything bad, you fail the course." That's essentially what happened in 1957 at the end of this 100 Flowers campaign. Those students and teachers and intellectuals that did speak out during the 100 Flowers campaign, well, they weren't just killed outright, but short of state-sponsored execution, they were certainly mistreated. They were sometimes paraded with literal dunce caps. They were pilloried, beaten, dismissed from their jobs. Later, a Chinese leader would suggest that perhaps 500,000 people felt this backlash, and a large percentage of those were sent to labour camps or to be reformed in the countryside. Naturally, many would die as a result of that treatment, and a large number of those might have been suicides. Now, the bigger point here is the message that this sends to the people. For those that had spoken out, said the things that they had been thinking, dared to question the party, well, it is now abundantly clear, not only after this campaign, but the earlier socialist transformations and their associated violence and death. The message is this: do not question us. Do what we say. This message was also felt within the party itself, and hundreds of thousands of party members were investigated, reprimanded, or even purged from the party for deviating from their so-called party line. In the background, Mao felt that this experiment with liberalization had been a failure, that perhaps there was a need to return to the rigid, tried and tested strategy of mass mobilization and top-down directives. That great things could happen as long as everyone put their minds to it and did what they were told. The Soviets had seemingly begun going down the wrong path, and their model was not producing the kinds of stratospheric gains that had been expected in China. And for Mao, his preeminence and cult of personality could not be extinguished like what he had seen them do to the memory of Stalin. Mao knew what he wanted, but was still looking for an answer in how to accomplish it. By May of 1958, he is quoted as saying, "Apart from the Soviet method, is it possible to find something even faster and better?" Mao began talking about the possibility of the countryside being utilized in a way that would propel China forward, allow them to attain the highest crop yields in the world, that steel production would reach 20 million tons a year, more than 4 times its current output. Having laid the groundwork of collectivization, witnessed its utility in relation to a series of water conservancy plans, and at the same time shown that there would be no tolerance of dissent to the regime, it became possible to plan the policies we consider the Great Leap Forward to represent, and some of them had actually already been put into effect. I awakened in the early morning by a woman's blood-curdling screams. Rushing to my window, I saw that a young woman was running to and fro on the roof of the building next door, frantically waving a bamboo pole with a large sheet tied to it. Suddenly the woman stopped, but a moment later, down in the street, a drum started beating, and she resumed her frightful screams and the mad waving of her peculiar flag. I realized that in all the upper stories of the hotel, white-clad females were waving sheets and towels that were supposed to keep the sparrows from alighting on the building. So that quote, that rendition of the quote, is from a Russian technician who was staying in the People's Republic in 1957, and the rather chaotic scene he is describing is an example of probably one of the more infamous and tragic-comic policies that comprise the Great Leap Forward. Mao had insisted that the 4 pests be eliminated, making China a country with no rats, no sparrows, no flies, and no mosquitoes. Considering the weight that Mao's words carried, it should be no surprise that millions and millions of citizens rallied to his call, like the woman the Russian was describing, and the team of those helping her. In this kind of mad, frantic conglomeration of people, this human machine, designed to shoo away sparrows. In this manner, the sparrows, small, cute birds as they are, were thought to be ruining crops. If the goal was to boost agriculture in such a dramatic way, well, sparrowcide, that's a phrase I'm borrowing from Philip Short's book, would seem to be the best answer, wouldn't it? A different visiting Russian reported that some months after this war against nature, that he did not see a single sparrow in his 4-week visit, either swatted out of the air, trapped in various ways, or made to fly away constantly until they were falling to the ground and dying of exhaustion. Here we have a window into the kind of thinking that will produce one of the worst human-made disasters of the 20th century, but perhaps of all time. Mao had ignored warnings that this defeat of the sparrows would actually cause more harm to China's crops, as the caterpillars that they ate would remain unscathed. They would multiply, and then soon infest the crops. This is quite simple, isn't it? This is a very easy example to hold on to and remember as poor planning, poor decision-making, ignorance of reality, and willingness to simply throw humans at a problem. It is perhaps one of the least awful examples to begin with, depending on how you feel about sparrows, I guess, but it does encapsulate some part of the core problem with what the CCP were about to really embark upon. In the words of Richard Baum, quote, "In 1958, Mao Zedong attempted to dramatically accelerate China's economic development with the Great Leap Forward. Distrustful of Khrushchev's revisionism, Mao abandoned the Soviet model of socialist construction and struck out in an uncharted direction, hoping to leapfrog the Russians and beat them to the promised land of communism. It was an audacious gamble, and it would fail miserably. End quote. Now, before we get into just how tragic the Great Leap Forward became, I want to briefly look at Maoism and see how the ideology which sprung from the Chinese leader will help inform the events that follow in China and, just to set up what their utility is for the Khmer communists later as well. So I consider Mao to be the third or fourth great prophet of communism. Now, some might throw Stalin in there as well, but I guess it depends on who you ask. And just to recap though, Marx gave the idea of history as the struggle between economic classes. The idea that history itself has this progressive, almost linear stage after stage, step-by-step kind of process to it, as well as the idea of class revolution being inevitable in an industrialized, capitalist society. These were some of the last stages of history, and then you would have to get socialism, then communism. Now, Lenin came along and said, hey, what if it didn't need to be this whole working class that suddenly came to the correct revolutionary way of thinking? What if you didn't have to wait for a society to become sufficiently industrialized or capitalist? What if just a sufficiently revolutionary-minded vanguard could lead a society into revolution? Surely once you did that, the whole world would follow. Spontaneously, the Russian Revolution would lead to a worldwide one. Now, that didn't quite happen, but an empire did come out of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, and it was soon led by Stalin, and he embarked on a highly centralized, highly authoritarian regime that focused on economic planning and a command economy. And by 1953, Stalin is dead, and now we are left with Mao. And what is Mao's great contribution to the communist canon? Well, he has a few. We've spoken about a few of them in previous episodes, but his idea of new democracy is one of them, which is basically an addition, an amendment to that Leninist idea of shortcutting toward communism, whereby for the bulk of human societies on the planet, socialism will need to be made against feudal or imperialist systems and done by national groups run by communists. That's a bit of a mouthful there, but if we look at how Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese Workers' Party achieved victory in Vietnam, kind of an example of that in action. Communist group takes on a nationalist cause, wins against a feudalist imperialist power, takes over a country, or half of it. It's a way of working around that fact that, Marxism is this mid-19th century ideology. It was originally put forth as this idea where only the biggest, most industrial and capitalist countries would see a communist revolution, like in the US, like in Germany, when in reality, the ideology became far more useful to movements which looked to emancipate themselves from so-called imperialist countries, and the bulk of these were decidedly uncapitalist and unindustrialized. Mao's thoughts on new democracy were a way to generalize socialist ideals to a wider, truly global audience. Another idea that he put forth, and one that again draws heavily on his sinification of Marxism, as we mentioned earlier, and it could also really be traced back to kind of Confucian tradition perhaps, it's this idea of so-called right thinking, now which I feel the etymology there and the Chinese translations will basically get you something close to thought reform, making your thoughts transformed into the correct ones. Right thinking. And we saw that put into practice when we spoke about the early years of the regime just a moment ago, and the needs to make previously untrustworthy classes of people remodel the way they thought into the way that suited the party. And this, to me, lends itself to some of the scarier parts of communism as a whole, and what I guess we could define as, thought crimes, particularly when we look at the example of the Khmer Rouge and how they would define, whole populations of people as counter-revolutionaries just because of their supposed inability to adopt the correct mental position, the revolutionary consciousness, as they will put it. Another aspect of Maoism is the inherent struggle, violent struggle that it's built upon. One of the famous phrases associated with the ideology is that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. But that being said, it's not like infusing a communist revolution with a degree of political violence is new for this ideology. I mean, Marx was talking about a global revolution from the get-go. Classes rising up and overthrowing other classes. And when Lenin and Stalin come along, they were certainly not shy of using coercive violence to further their revolutionary aims. But perhaps Mao brought with him, perhaps due in some part just to the circumstances of the Chinese Revolution and the Civil War, an idea called People's War. Now, this is sort of tied to his inclusiveness of the peasant class as sort of the base for their whole revolutionary movement. After all, the Chinese communists, while they were fighting their civil war, well, they didn't really have urban bases to stage their revolution from. They needed to proletarianize the peasantry, and doing so through a massive kind of guerrilla war. That was key to Maoism. Now, he was from a rural background, so he enmeshed himself with the so-called masses. And this kind of leads us into another tenet of Maoism, which could be thought of as volunteerism, that people can achieve anything if they just put their minds to it. Mass mobilization of people is a viable method in Maoism of achieving your aims, particularly with the kind of militaristic and ideological thinking that the party insisted that the people must adopt. Hence why the regime described some of the early phases of the Great Leap Forward, including massive labour communes where tens of thousands of people were used in the countryside to dig new canals, dams and reservoirs. Well, this was deemed a kind of people's war against nature. The labourers were awoken at dawn by the sound of recorded bugle calls. They marched in step with their tools slung over one arm to the worksite, and they ate their meals in communal canteens. And just like a war, well, the leaders sending their troops into battle, they'd expect a few casualties. Frank Dicotta describes some of this war on nature and Maoism in practice in these early Great Leap projects. Quote, "All over China, farmers were being driven to the edge of starvation on gigantic irrigation schemes, pushed hard by cadres afraid of being labelled rightists. Having spent half an hour shoveling gravel himself, Mao was in a good position to see the human cost of the irrigation campaign. In March 1958, as he listened to a report by Jiang Wei-king on irrigation in Jiangsu, he mused that Wu Zhipu claims he can move 30 billion cubic meters. I think 30,000 people will die. Zhang Shishang has said that he will move 20 billion cubic meters, and I think that 20,000 people will die. Wei King only promises 600 million cubic meters. Maybe nobody will die." Now, Dicotta stops quoting Mao and goes on to add himself. Mass mobilization on water conservancy schemes continued unabated for several years, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of exhausted villagers already weakened by hunger. In a chilling precursor of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, villagers in Qingxi, Gansu, called these projects the killing fields. End quote. Talking about billions of cubic meters of earth being moved is wild stuff. Now, these irrigation and water conservation projects, the mass mobilization involved in creating them, this is a good place to start talking about the great leap forward that really begins in earnest in 1958. Mao was made so confident by these apparently excessive successes of these projects that he felt that this revolutionary will, this mass mobilization, could literally be just unleashed. That everything could be doubled, tripled, even more if they just harnessed the will of the people. In his words, lift the lid, break down superstition, and let the initiative and creativity of the labouring people explode. However, as many of these examples will show, the figures that Mao was being fed about how many acres of earth had been moved by however many millions of people, well, largely it had been greatly exaggerated. Richard Baum uses the phrase, a bubble of unreality, to describe China during the Great Leap, as all levels of the country fall victim to something he also calls target fever, and this willingness to lie in order to appease those above. Now, I'm not saying that to blame those people that are feeding this information to those above them. Rather, the leadership itself, the leaders that created this system in the first place and chose to believe these figures, even when they stretched credulity, to say the least, they are more responsible, or it's some circle of responsibility. Massive people's communes, as they became known, became the agricultural setting for this part of the Great Leap. More than 20,000 people would be set in this impersonal relationship with farming the land. In this bubble of unreality, some communes began claiming huge successes with fantastic new agricultural revolutions. And this kind of strikes me as similar kinds of reasoning as the incidents of sparrowcide that we discussed earlier. Some communes simply start posting up huge figures because the commune next to them had done so. They'll start spreading these harebrained ideas like, well, we can just increase the yield of a harvest by, double or triple fertilizing their crops. I mean, fertilizer's good, right? If we just put more on, we'll get more. Some other commune said that, well, you can grow more rice by simply double or triple planting it. Plant more seeds in the same area. It's simple. If you put the seed further into the soil, it'll produce a stronger plant. There was even this famous photo that was spread by the propaganda machine of children playing on top of a plot of rice. Like, the rice was so densely packed and strong that it was being used as a kind of, like a trampoline. Immediately, cadres who see this have to consider ways that they can emulate this success as well, lest they be perceived as rightist or deviationist in their thinking. Now, I know that Orwell's terminology gets overused sometimes in relation to communist and authoritarian projects, but this really is some 2 + 2 = 5 kind of stuff. Like, that it's not real, but it kind of is real because the party says it's real. Naturally, the party begins increasing its expected figures for harvests based on the excesses that these communes are producing. It seems like the shortcut to communism might be working after all. Mao had encouraged this unreal version of reality. As record after record is smashed, it becomes less important that, for instance, that photo of the children on top of the rice crop was fraudulent, that the whole thing was a sham, that planting rice seeds deeper in the earth or too close together wouldn't improve upon the thousands of years of practice that traditional farming methods had perfected. Again, This is the Great Leap Forward. Traditional thinking was incorrect. And it would be based on this unreal success of the agricultural communes that the regime said, hey, why don't we employ the same techniques into different industries to produce other products? Not only would Mao begin raising targets of grain to be more than the rest of the world combined in just over a decade. Hey, simple. What we're also going to do is begin efforts setting the people's collective strength to increase steel production as well. And why wouldn't they? Steel had this kind of cachet for newly modernizing countries in the 20th century. Like it was both an actual resource that could be produced and traded and sold, but it also symbolized modernity. It stood for something. Now, if you're producing plentiful steel products, well, you've stood up with the other big boy countries and you're being counted, aren't you? I think it was in one of the first couple of episodes that I referenced the brilliant computer game series Age of Empires, and in those games I remember you'd kind of progress through ages, your bronze, iron, etc. And in this instance you could kind of imagine a steel age, this industrial product. Many nations begin to see themselves needing to qualify for this. They need to progress to that. You can imagine these other countries that got there looking on like, oh, well, you're still in the agriculture and small manufactured goods stage. How quaint. You know, these symbolic powers of the world stage, Britain, Germany, the United States, the Soviet Union, they all had this backbone of industry. And the symbol of that was steel. And again, this goes back to that Marxist 19th century idea that industrialization is key, capitalism is key. You need factories pumping out smoke and steel, and then you're going to get communism. So this glory of steel was something that Mao and the Communist Party were really drawn to. And their solution to any kind of goal now was essentially found in the will of their people and the capacity of the government to basically throw enough human beings at a problem until it was solved. That's how they're going to have a great leap forward, not just in agriculture, but also industry. With the people's communes already available and a populace positioned to do whatever the government instructed them to do, it was decided that the seemingly bountiful crops that had been collected following these initial agricultural pushes could be counted on, and a percentage of those who had been put to work on these collective farms would instead be diverted toward the production of steel. I don't think I've ever said steel so many times in this short amount of time, but when you think of steel, like me, you probably think of some vague kind of factory setting, very industrial, something out of the end of Terminator 2 or Alien 3. The steel production that would be employed during the Great Leap Forward, however, was just about as far away from that kind of setting that you can imagine. Now, I'm not saying that China didn't have factories in its cities and, ways of making steel that would be familiar to that kind of image that's conjured in your mind by the word. But the people's communes, these massive rural areas, they would begin efforts at making steel that relied upon small kind of what are known as backyard furnaces. Imagine these relatively, small structures that resemble something like an urn shape or even something vaguely insectoid like a kind of termite's nest. Some larger than a grown adult and some smaller. In September 1958, just 14% of China's steel was produced in these kinds of local small furnaces. A month later, that figure skyrockets to 49%. At the peak of this movement, within the Great Leap Forward, somewhere around 90 million people, a quarter of the active population, abandoned whatever else they had been doing and made steel in these furnaces. And people are, they are throwing themselves into this work with the same gusto that they had when they were swatting sparrows out of the sky. Target fever also rears its ugly head again, so the need to produce as much steel as possible in order to stand out again becomes paramount. Soon enough, you have people throwing anything they can into these furnaces in order to make steel, tools, bicycles, even household utensils like pots, pans, and woks. Now, this, like so many other events in the Great Leap Forward, is such a great example of people's lives being reduced to just numbers in the pursuit of a state's interest. And this is just the latest example. You need a canal dug? Hey, throw tens of thousands of people at the earth with shovels until it's done. You want more harvests? Well, you just get 25,000 people to live on a giant farm and you tell them what to grow. The state aims to surpass Britain in steel production in just a few years? Oh, I guess you better make a backyard furnace and spend all day keeping the fire in it going, and when you've run out of materials to smelt, well, then I guess you better throw your spatula in there. Your knives too. You know what? Let's throw the family wok in there as well. In an environment when you can imagine just how important these things would have been to a household. Even now, even in my house, if I got a letter in the mail from the government saying that they needed my favorite fry pan, I'd be cross. This is what I'm talking about. The individual, even the family to an extent, is completely superseded by the state in this kind of scenario. Your life would only exist in its capacity to carry out the work that supports the state. So we've got a mixture of state domination as well as this communist vision and the energy that is being produced by that vision and a certain amount of coercion as well in the population. And it's producing ideas like, hey, why don't we double plant our rice seeds? Then we'll have a higher yield. Or we'll, rip out crops that have traditionally done well in one location just in order to produce something that the state has decided needs to be planted there instead. The same kind of thing is happening with this steel production. And even though you are technically making large amounts of quote-unquote steel, it's brittle, of very low quality, and it's practically unusable. It's a waste of time. Think about these vast fields of furnaces, the pollution, the working conditions, the huge amounts of trees that have had to be cut down to produce the firewood to keep the furnaces going. Frank Ducotta, in his book, he talks about people's homes being torn down to produce more flammable material to keep these furnaces going. It's all for nothing. No, even nothing. Worse, we can see in the experiment with the backyard steel production how the Great Leap begins to trip and fall before approaching anywhere near a position where it leaps over anything, instead planting its face squarely into the ground. At the same time that everyone is patting themselves on the back about all of this steel that is being produced, hopes for record-breaking harvests were also a certainty. The Politburo spoke of production being increased by 100%, several 100%, 1,000%, several 1,000%. These are figures that are so delusional that they border on schizophrenic. Imagine these cadres sitting around a table, slapping their reports proudly with the back of a hand, saying, "Oh, you think your region's harvest is going to be good? Well, look here, comrade. Harvests in my district are going to be 10 times as much as they were before the advent of the People's Commune. And the steel we are making? Well, it's infused with the will of the people. Those imperialists in the United States and Britain, well, they won't know what hit them. Even the Soviets will envy our efforts." Philip Short says that by the winter of 1958, even Mao had begun to, look at some of these figures, and while he was still, more or less convinced that there had been this surge in productivity across the board, that the Great Leap was, in fact, in motion, well, some of the numbers, like we said, several 1,000% gains, he's thinking, okay, maybe some people are going a little overboard with their estimations here. But that's okay. On the whole, we're definitely going well. At the end of 1958, Mao looked back and said, "During this past year, there have been so many good things. Trails have been blazed. Many things have been realized about which we did not even dare to dream before." His vision of China pioneering its own path to communism seemed to be coming true. The Russian model had been shown deficient. Mao presumed that he had found the way to reach the promised land. He had the numbers in hand, propped up by delusional propaganda and intended ignorance. This mirage of communism and the energy which it provided those guiding tens of millions of people toward it. If they had only looked closer, if these leaders had just stepped out of this bubble of unreality, they could have noticed that as early as February 1958, starvation had already appeared in some villages, even during just the Water Conservancy campaign that created the initial conditions for the Great Leap Forward to spring out of. The writing was on the wall, and the disaster was already beginning to unfold around them. And make no mistake, they, the leaders, had created the conditions for this disaster. We are getting to the stage of the Great Leap Forward, where things are already beginning to look bad. But we are about to get to the point where we can stop calling it by its, glorious propaganda name, and by its much more accurate descriptor. The Great Leap, famine. One of the things that facilitates the starvation part of the Great Leap is what follows from these massive collections of people known as the People's Communes. These farms of tens of thousands of people, where the intention was for the state to provide them with everything they need: shelter, food, and work. If a person or family have those things provided for them, then you are that much closer to communism, right? They don't need to pay taxes, they don't need to pay rent. Technically, they don't even need to pay for their own dinner. We will give that to them as well. Now, in a way, they were trying to eradicate the need for private property, which was seen as the root of capitalism and inequality in a Marxist lens. This leads to what is known as communal eating. And this was hugely important for Mao. He felt this was part of that correction of someone's whole way of being, to proletarianize them, to make them part of the people's army. Not only were you getting the labor that these people provide, but you were also trying to change their lifestyle to suit the state's needs. Now, I think sometimes people hear communal eating and you think, yeah, I can imagine that. I've been on school camp, and okay, that's being a bit glib, but this is a podcast mainly concerned with Khmer Rouge. So no doubt many of you listening may be somewhat aware that communal eating was a big part of that regime and what they inflicted upon Cambodia during their time in power. It's often remembered as one of the most awful things that Cambodians had to live through during that time. But your mind often becomes concerned more with, the killings or the forced work or the prisons. Those were often the ways people died. But sometimes what is even more horrifying were the ways that they had to live. The reason why communal eating is actually one of the most horrifying things that an authoritarian regime can institute is because of how it, generally speaking, deprives people of one of their most basic human rights, and foundations of well-being, the right to eat. Communal eating during the Great Leap Forward was a total nightmare. And like many things in this series, it's a nightmare born out of supposedly good intentions. In August of 1958, Mao had said that communism would start with something like communal eating. Something like, hey, free food, that's communism. Whereas in reality, local cadres were entrusted with allocating increasingly scarce food supplies, and they suddenly acquired powers of life and death over the population that they controlled. When the bubble of unreality pops, when all those ludicrous figures about production and harvest turn out to be false, when mismanagement of the grain that was grown becomes a problem, when targets for export remain high despite lack of available resources for the population, when the mirage of utopia transforms into a wasteland, well, the ladle that cadre holds in the canteen doesn't simply become an instrument that turns out some gruel onto a plate. It becomes a weapon of the state. By the end of 1958, seemingly all of the policies enacted which were part of the Great Leap become critical failures. The war on nature, including the sparrowcide we talked about earlier, led to huge numbers of insects descending on the crops remaining. Insecticides had been squandered in the early attempts to wipe out pests across the board, and they were missing when they were needed most in the wake of the natural predators of these insects being close to extinct. The deforestation caused by the Steel Campaign led to soil erosion and water loss. The enormous water irrigation schemes further disturbed the ecological balance, worsening the impact of inundating rains as well as droughts, which in turn created the conditions that led to swarms of locusts. All of the mistakes made in the Great Leap Forward so far are akin to someone thinking they could jump over a canyon and ignore that they were falling far short of the other side until they were just a few feet above the jagged rocks at the bottom. And how does the leadership respond to the growing consensus that is coming from the ground? Well, in a sadly predictable way. They blame so-called bad elements. Sabotage by counter-revolutionaries, reactionaries. This is failures of leadership on local levels. Bandits. In fact, as malnutrition and starvation began to break out on quite widespread levels, few of those in high leadership positions would have the courage to actually speak out about what was going on to Mao, even though the great leader himself was being sent hundreds of letters from around the country from people who were suffering deeply. Because speaking out against the Great Leap could have the consequences of labeling you as some kind of dissenting deviationist, it took tremendous bravery to actually take the steps to criticize what was going on. One of the leaders who did this was the Minister of National Defense, a man named Peng Dehuai. Now, he heard numerous reports of the hardship of the countryside and took it upon himself to embark on a mission to investigate this for himself, see it firsthand. And what he saw shocked him. It was a lot different to what the state's propaganda would have had you believe. Starvation, cadre beating exhausted peasants, horrible communal eating halls, and these backyard furnaces wasting time and resources. In 1959, at a Central Committee meeting, Peng Dehuai actually compiled a 5-page letter to Mao that detailed what he had seen on this mission. Richard Baum paraphrases some of these findings as such, quote, he, Peng, noted that the habit of exaggeration had spread throughout the country in the summer of 1958, and that tremendous harm had been done when reports of unbelievable miracles were published in the party press. People had become dizzy with success, believing that communism was just around the corner. He went on to note that despite the masses' initial enthusiasm for the people's communes, many communal dining halls had been poorly run, the backyard steel furnaces had squandered material and financial resources, and in general, the Great Leap had been launched hastily, without a plan for achieving necessary balance. End quote. And that really sums things up pretty well, doesn't it? Fairly appraised, not overly critical, based on first-hand accounts and investigation. The kind of report that a government which was first and foremost concerned with the well-being of its people would certainly welcome, as they sought to correct any missteps or failures that they might have created in their policies. They might have said, "Hey, Peng, thank you for your hard work and going out there and making this report and bringing us back all this information. We're going to get right on top of this. I can't believe this is happening." Well, no, not quite. As you might have guessed, that was not the response from Mao and the leadership he had closely knit around him. I almost want to go off on a bit of a tangent here about Mao himself, about the person and the idea of, great man theory of history, where you see historical events and outcomes less in terms of complicated intermingling of cultures, circumstances, economics, political developments, environmental developments, and, more just the personalities of kings and queens and those in positions of power. It's a fairly old school way of looking at things, and perhaps seen as a little passé in modern historical literature. Fair enough. It is a little narrow in its focus, but it's not to say that, especially in circumstances where someone has risen to a kind of leadership position where their will and their dictates are more or less absolute, that some element of their personality, or something along those lines, would have some degree of influence. I believe it was in the last episode, actually, we spoke about Salot Tsar's former mentor, Kang Van-sa, and he had this idea that because of the sexual frustration that Tsar had felt in his late 20s, well, this somehow spurred him on to radical politics and then on to more extreme policies enacted by the Khmer Rouge. And that, for me, as I said in that episode, is a version of that slightly unappealing armchair psychology mixed with great man theory of history in a way that goes a little too far. It's a little simplistic. That being said, we have spent many hours in this series discussing the context of Salot Tsar's life. It's not like it's irrelevant. The influence of his worldview and his journey into being a revolutionary does have a place in the story. But I've tried to balance that with explanations of Cambodia's history and the context in which he grew up and having the influence on him in the first place. I don't know, we're getting into chicken and egg territory here, but my long and meandering point here is that in certain circumstances, it's warranted to look at the personalities of people in charge when looking for some measure of cause and effect in a given historical scenario. Not all the time, but sometimes. And this is kind of a case in point with Mao. I haven't really wanted to steer too far down this track for a number of reasons, but Mao is, he is a distinct personality. We've seen him wave his hand at figures of thousands of people being expected to die in irrigation projects. But, that pales in comparison to, he once famously spoke of a nuclear holocaust in terms that shocked other world leaders, saying that, "Hey, I'm not afraid of nuclear war. There are 2.7 billion people in the world. Doesn't matter if some are killed. China has a population of 600 million. Even if half of them are killed, there are still 300 million people left. It's pretty wild stuff. He was famously crude in some of his dealings. You know, the one that has stuck in my mind ever since reading it a couple of years ago. I'm not going to use the word that he did. Well, it was in relation to it was essentially a kind of harem of young women he engaged with regularly, and Mao, from a rural area, was somewhat rustic in some of his language, as well as some of his habits of personal hygiene. He once told his personal physician, "I wash myself in the bodies of my women." He also knowingly infected them with venereal diseases. And this was from the mouth of a leader of a regime who some will point to as positively feminist, in terms of his famous proclamation that women can hold up half the sky. But I digress. I mean, the point I'm trying to make, and one that is illustrated by that nauseating phrase that he used, even in its censored form, by the way, is that Mao is quite distinct. He's a distinct person. What he thinks matters. How he personally reacts matters. The Great Leap Forward was very much his vision, and Peng Dehuai had challenged his vision. And what would Mao's reaction be? And what example would that set? Before I went down that path of discussing Mao, we're talking about this Central Committee meeting taking place in this famously picturesque mountain resort in Lushan, Jiangxi province. And Mao had been handed this letter, ostensibly just for him, by his opinionated defense minister. I mean, it's not like this was a visceral teardown of the Great Leap either. It starts with, a lot of groveling, far be it from me to question your intellect, Chairman Mao, kind of stuff. But it does point out a couple of flaws. Now, regardless, it's not what Mao wants to hear. Firstly, he circulates the letter that Peng had given him to everyone else at the conference. In a way, you can imagine something along the lines of, "Hey, read this. What do you think? Do you agree with what's in this letter?" And naturally, if the boss man calls you into an office and asks you to read something that is highly critical of him, and then asks if you agree, well, you're not likely to side with the unseen person who wrote the letter, are you? In a way, Mao was actually setting up his defense before going on the attack. Once he's done so, he calls a full session of everyone in attendance at the conference, not only to address his detractor, but also to ensure that there aren't any little pockets of resistance that might be able to form in the shadows. I'm not sure why, but I always imagine this scene occurring at a rather large dinner table. I don't think it did, but feel free to imagine it like that along with me as I explain the scene. Once everyone is seated, in something akin to a mafia movie, Mao kind of generally threatens those present in a speech, but it is clear whom the message is directed to. It's this rambling speech that eventually boils down to this: "Are you with me or against me? Just see what happens if you dare to go against the Great Leap at this crucial time." And he pauses for effect at several points before several top generals start shouting his praise and pledging their allegiance. Peng Dehuai is apparently quite brave, but also famously short-tempered. And after this public humiliation amongst the top leaders of the People's Republic of China, knowing that he had in fact sugar-coated his report to Mao, with all kinds of skirting around blame and the true scale of famine and disaster remaining fairly under wraps, well, At this humiliation from the leader, he loses it. He yells at Mao, "You are a dictator. You are like Stalin in his latest years." And then it becomes a full-on scene from one of those reality TV shows with people shouting across the table at one another. Zhou Enlai chimes in to support the chairman and tear down his detractor by saying, "No, you have adopted a rightist opportunist stance. The target of your letter was our party's general political line." And Mao reinforces this. He says, "You wanted to bring about the disintegration of the party. You have a plan, you have an organization, you have made preparations. You have attacked our correct line from a rightist standpoint." And then he goes on a fairly expletive-laden tirade involving accusations of sexual relations with people's mothers. Peng, finally defeated, says, "If you all think this way, it's very difficult for me to see anything. But you need not worry, I won't commit suicide. I'll never be a counter-revolutionary. I can still go out and work in the fields." A few days later, the Central Committee passes an official resolution condemning Peng Dehuai, accusing him of heading a right opportunist anti-party clique, of making vicious attacks on Mao, and focusing on transient and partial shortcomings in order to paint a pitch-black picture of the present situation. Peng was stripped of his post and put under house arrest. Sadly, in an effort to prove that the former Minister of Defense was incorrect, the Great Leap Forward was doubled down upon. Cadre, having seen what dissenting would do, were now going to exaggerate their support for the Great Leap Forward. Targets were ratcheted back up again. The population was forced to surrender more and more of their meager harvest to the state. Mao insisted that China repay its debt to Moscow ahead of schedule, and even more material was squeezed out of an already diminished supply. Local officials would need to become even more coercive to meet delivery quotas, the results of which we will visit in a moment. The 1959 harvest was the worst for several years. The government announced that 270 million tons had been gathered in, rather than the true figure, not disclosed until 20 years later, which was 170 million tons. Authorities blamed exceptional weather, but Chinese meteorologists later confirmed that conditions were not that different from normal. And in 1959, the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic, hundreds of millions would go hungry. And one of the worst man-made disasters of all time would truly take hold. But for the leadership, the blame for this will not lay on their shoulders, but rather on the people starving, because the only reason that things could be going wrong was the willful sabotage of the Great Leap Forward. In the efforts to reinvigorate an already failing Great Leap Forward, a cascading wave of starvation, fear, coercion, overwork, and sorrow engulfed the People's Republic. I've struggled at times to consolidate this vast wave of misery into a format suitable for a podcast. I've spent most of this episode setting up this period of the Great Leap Forward, the period from 1959 to 1961. And I think it may be necessary for me to simply begin telling stories about how people died, without going into the quibbling on numbers too much. We are, at least, talking about tens of millions of people. In terms of populations, I mean, I live in Australia, and we are talking about at least the entire modern-day population of Australia. At least 25 million people dying in barely more than just a few years. And that's the conservative estimate. Indeed, it could be closer to double that number. I'm going to discuss this staggering death toll with a few points to make. The first is to relate that this was not a famine in the sense that it was the cause of some natural disaster and more or less an act of God. The sinking of the Titanic was one of the first industrial disasters mankind faced, and it involved a natural phenomena, an iceberg. But it wasn't really the iceberg's fault. Likewise, the famine in China was a result of the Great Leap Forward, which was a policy designed and enacted by a regime. Another point that I would like to emphasize is that while the vast majority of these deaths will be related to starvation, that starvation itself is part of the death toll. When we are talking about the mass death in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, which is in the region of 2 million people, at least half of those deaths were the result of state-sponsored violence. The other deaths were due to disease, overwork, famine. But we are still very much counting the deaths that occurred from starvation in the same space as the murders that the Khmer Rouge committed. And perhaps that will become clearer as we go on. Now, the third point is related to the second in that while we may generally consider the mass death that occurred during the Great Leap Forward as a result of famine, disease, imprisonment, and overwork, well, it's not to say there wasn't a great deal of those who perished as a result of violence at the hands of the state. Frank Dakota suggests that a figure as high as 2.5 million were beaten or tortured to death during the Great Leap. With those points in mind, I will start this story with the tale of a young girl named Ding Qiao. As I outlined before, the advent of collectivization, the people's communes, and communal eating, while intended to be this wonderful, benevolent, and communist thing, what really became quite a horrible subversion of human rights in reality. When parents were too busy working in fields or in backyard steel furnaces, children necessarily became the family's way of retrieving the allocated ration from the communal canteen. Imagine a child as young as 4, sent to walk, sometimes a considerable distance, perhaps kilometers, to then have to wait in line with adults, jostle for space, and carry back this meager food to their family. Frank Dakota states that many alive today who lived through this carry guilt for having let their families down in one way or another, as they engaged in this role. One of these people was the aforementioned Ding Qiao, who was 8 years old when she had to take care of her entire family of 6. Her father was sick, her mother had kidney stones and injuries relating to her bound feet. Both could not work and therefore deemed more or less useless by the state. Every day the 8-year-old girl queued in the canteen for more than an hour, all the while being bullied by adults hungry enough to do so. She recalled that one day, after being handed the one bowl of watery porridge that her family depended on, there'd been a lot of rain recently and the poor girl slipped on her way home and spilt the bowl on the ground. She remembered crying until she realized she had to scrape whatever she could into the bowl for her family waiting for this minuscule but essential amount of nourishment. She remembered how angry her family were at her, blaming her for wasting this ration. But in the end, they ate it anyway. Slowly, because it was full of sand. I realize that this story is, well, going to pale in comparison to what we will get into, but I include it particularly at the start as a way of addressing this insidious and quite tragic element that accompanies any kind of government policy that so deeply affects the bonds of family and inflicts a kind of trauma upon children. I'm not saying that it's unique to this regime, or indeed just to communist or totalitarian regimes, but as we expand on this story, and then eventually into the crimes of the Khmer Rouge in later episodes, I just feel that the role of children is such a terrible one. And Ding Kea's story, while in and of itself merely sad but not completely tragic, well, that's what I mean. It's just a beginning, if you will. For instance, Ai Long, a 13-year-old boy who looked after the ducks in Guangdong, he was caught digging up roots for food. He was forced to assume the aeroplane position covered in excrement and had bamboo inserted under his nails. The beatings he received were so bad that he suffered crippling physical effects for life. In the same province, a local cadre beat to death an 8-year-old boy who had stolen a handful of rice. In Hunan province, 12-year-old Tan Kung King was drowned in a pond for having stolen food from the canteen. These examples are given in Frank Dicotta's book, and he then goes on to describe another event in the same village, where for the crime of stealing, again, a handful of rice, the local cadre forced the father of this boy to bury him alive. The father himself died of grief just a few days later. Now, I'll apologize if necessary to some of the listeners, if you are listening, that might be quite adverse to hearing these kinds of tragic stories that are particular to children, so I won't spend too much more time doing so in this episode, except for perhaps one more, which I found very sad in my research. It involved a woman named Gu Hongsheng, who was on her own with 3 children. She was refused absence of work to take one of her children, a 5-year-old, to the hospital. She went anyway. The journey there and back took 10 days, a period in which the 5-year-old had died, despite arriving at the hospital. When she returned, she realized that her 2 remaining children had been ignored by the rest of the village as a kind of reprisal led by the cadre in charge as a punishment for her disobeying their orders. I'll spare you the description of the children as she returned, but suffice to say that they both died soon after she came back. A local cadre would then loudly bang on her door in the days and weeks afterwards, reminding her or denouncing her as a shirker from work. Dakota states that she soon lost her mind as a result. In these examples, we see the interplay of the state, the policies they are enacting, the political energy that members of the party are harnessing to mete out punishments on behalf of the party, the violence, the killings. We see the breakdown of family bonds and the harsh treatment of children. The overarching theme being that work was the primary commodity. You were not much more than a number, and coercing you by whatever means necessary was okay as long as it served the state, even if that meant killing children. In any case, how do we explain this violence, though, this use of terror as coercion? Well, we touched on this earlier in the episode in our brief discussion of some of the tenets of Maoism itself, and some of the context of the Chinese Revolution generally. What I would point to as a potential explanation for this use of violence, this image of flogging an already dead horse comes to mind. It's the general militarization of the revolution itself. The revolution came out of a violent civil war, indeed decades of war. So the party itself was used to this kind of violence as a means of achieving its revolutionary aims. There's also the way that this militarization stretched itself into non-military modes. We spoke about a war on nature, the way that the population of China had generally been conscripted into a kind of regiment, even though the army was not aimed specifically at military conquest or defense. It was just a means of achieving their domestic political aims. Everyone was part of this Chinese army that was part of the revolutionary Maoist spirit to achieve communism quicker than everyone else. The Great Leap Forward relied on everyone being a soldier for that revolution. As Frank Dicotta says, quote, "The one-party state under Mao did not concentrate all its resources on the extermination of specific groups of people, with the exception, of course, of counter-revolutionary saboteurs, spies, and enemies of the people. Political categories vague enough potentially to include anybody and everybody. But Mao did throw the country into the Great Leap Forward, extending the military structure of the party to all of society. Everyone a soldier," Mao had proclaimed at the height of the campaign, brushing aside such bourgeois niceties as a salary, a day off each week, or a prescribed limit on the amount of labour a worker should carry out. End quote. There is a certain, necessary, I guess, callousness and calculative thinking that goes into militarism, generally speaking, right? Like a war can only be won through a given amount of human sacrifice to achieve victory in battle. In the same way, the regime may have considered their continual revolution and path to communism as having a necessary amount of human casualty. So we can perhaps point to this as one factor that explains the perhaps 8% of the entire death toll during the Great Leap Forward, not just being the result of the policies generally, like overwork, famine, and starvation, the things that resulted from this planning, but also this quite large amount of state-sponsored violence which accompanied all of that. And this is something that, is pointed to by historians and historians of genocide in particular, where you'll see the context of conflict and war breeding the circumstances for mass death and genocide. For instance, so far in the series, we've seen in the French Revolution that the conflict there brought with it a familiarity with violence, and then that familiarity, in turn, became part of how the people were treated generally, and citizens became targets, enemies of the revolution. We haven't spoken about it much, but historians of genocide will often look at World War I, and during that war, we have one of the first genocides occurring in Armenia. Now, the violence against the people in the Soviet Revolution following the conclusion of the First World War. Another example, the Holocaust obviously springs to mind during the Second World War. Eventually, too, Cambodia will certainly confirm this recurring theme of generalized war becoming a breeding ground for massive state-sponsored killing, sometimes of their own people. China, in this instance, continues this. Although they were not at war during the Great Leap Forward, there were wars abroad, but we're still definitely looking at this highly militarized mode of society, at least after the outcome of their long civil war. So, forcing a father to bury his son alive, or punishing a mother for abandoning her post, by trying to take her son to the hospital, letting her 2 children die from neglect, that's just the equivalent of sending deserters to the firing squad, or treating other perceived counter-revolutionaries as prisoners of war. But as pointed out, this percentage of those meeting violent ends as enormous as it is still far outnumbered by those succumbing to the effects of starvation. Now, we've seen how the cadre at the collective canteen could use the ladle as a weapon too. And you have these terrible stories of those people being deprived of food long enough that they must begin eating their children's portion of a ration, for instance, causing that child to die as a result. Or indeed, abandoning children or the elderly as a means of self-preservation in the face of a lack of food, rather than through violent coercion. But starvation is the biggest killer. The basic result of these policies that plunge huge parts of China into famine. But what exactly is starvation? Well, essentially, the function of food intake is for your body to convert that into glucose in order to use that as energy for your vital organs and muscles. When that intake is severely lessened or stops altogether, the body attempts to maintain blood sugar levels by producing glycogen in the liver and breaking down stored fats and proteins. The liver can only do this for a few hours before the fatty acids from other parts of the body are used for this energy intake. After a period of weeks in this phase, the body will turn completely to your stored fats. The body tries to keep its most important organ functioning for as long as possible, the brain. And this is eventually done at the cost of muscles and other organs in the third phase of starvation, when fat stores are gone and the body turns to stored protein for energy. Well, that means the muscles are broken down and their proteins are converted into glucose as well. Your hair loses colour, the skin can begin flaking off, you'll suffer from edema, which is a kind of swelling due to fluids leaking out of blood vessels. This will give you that distended belly, which is so often associated with shocking photos of starvation. The rib cage becomes incredibly pronounced. Swelling around the knees can make walking incredibly painful, and eyes begin to bulge and stare vacantly. Your arms and legs become like twigs as your heart works harder, as it's required to keep pumping blood around an increasingly declining body weight. Eventually, curling up to conserve energy and drifting away from consciousness as your organs become so damaged that they fail, including your heart. Some kind of cardiac arrest will ultimately claim the starving person's life. Your body really does just sort of end up eating itself. Now, obviously, there are factors which influence this process. Children and the elderly with less fat will be affected much quicker, for instance. And the timing in which this takes place will also be influenced by just how much energy you are expending, and if you have any kind of calorie intake whatsoever. For this reason, you will often hear stories of people looking for sustenance in things that they wouldn't normally consider food. Leaves, bark, roots, etc. Which leads me to one of the most horrifying stories I encountered in my research for this episode. And I might as well quote directly and at length from Frank Ducota's Mao's Great Famine, the place where I initially read it, as he does quite a fantastic job at conveying this terrible scene, and perhaps better than what I would be able to approximate. So, quote, "When nothing else was left, people turned to a soft mud called Guanyin soil, named after the goddess of mercy. A work team sent by Li Jingquan was taken aback by what they saw in Qishan County in Sichuan. It was a vision of hell, as serried ranks of ghost leaf villagers queued up in front of deep pits, their shriveled bodies pouring with sweat under the glare of the sun, waiting for their turn to scramble down the hole and carve out a few handfuls of the porcelain-white mud. Children, their ribs starting through the skin, fainted from exhaustion, their grimy bodies looking like mud sculptures shadowing the earth. Old women in ragged clothes burned paper charms and bowed, hands folded, mumbling strange incantations. 250,000 kilos were dug out by more than 10,000 people. In one village alone, 214 families out of a total of 262 had eaten mud, several kilos per person. Some of the villagers filled their mouths with mud as they were digging in the pit, but most of them added water and kneaded the soil after mixing it with chaff and weeds, baking mud cakes that were filling, even if they offered little sustenance. Once eaten, the soil acted like cement, drying out the stomach and absorbing all the moisture inside the intestinal tract. Defecation became impossible. In every village, several people died a painful death, their colons blocked up with soil. All over China, from Sichuan, Gansu, Anhui to Henan, people tormented by ravening hunger turned to mud. End quote. So with decisions such as these to begin eating soil, you can imagine every other logical food being consumed before that. Diseased animals, rats, insects, bark, leaves. You can imagine the sheer amount of people dying, as well as the emaciated people who were too weak to be able to give them much more than shallow burials, if that. As I alluded to in the very first introduction to this episode, some people also began eating human flesh. Dakota suggests that this may have occurred as early as 1958, when this all began. And it became a practice that appeared in every region that became decimated by starvation. Generally speaking, it was more common to engage in necrophagy, that is, the eating of dead people, rather than the more general kind of cannibalism where people were killing people or children for the purpose of eating them, although that certainly did occur as well. Dakota describes one instance that highlights a kind of black market for human flesh that grew out of these extreme circumstances. A farmer had bartered a pair of shoes for a kilo of meat and found that it contained a human nose and several ears. Reports of this kind of activity were quite taboo, and those that did reach those in leadership positions would sometimes dismiss these incidents as, again, the work of counter-revolutionaries. They were just seeking to tarnish the reputation of the party in the Great Leap Forward by spreading these nasty rumours. Quite eloquently, Dakota points out that necrophagy, in this instance, should really be thought of along the lines of scavenging. In this case, those that were forced into these decisions, well, they had already extended what they were willing to scavenge far and wide, and eventually it reached the point of deceased human flesh. And in any case, the circumstances in which they were forced down that path are surely more degrading to the humans having to exhume and eat dead bodies, rather than degrading to the bodies themselves. We can only feel sorry for them. Now, I feel that some combination of the death toll itself, again, somewhere in excess of perhaps 30 million, up to 50, perhaps 45 is the number we're going to use here. Some combination of that number of people dying, as well as some of the stories I've shared here, the, mistreatment of an entire country of people to the point that some of them were forced into cannibalism. I'm describing some truly awful things that occurred during the Great Leap Famine, but there's much more that could have been said, obviously, considering the sheer amount of people who died over the 3 to 4 years in which this occurred. We didn't talk about things like disease, industrial accidents, poor treatment of women who were forced into roles that did not provide for their safety in particular, the disintegration of family, effects of pollution, the terrible toll on the natural spaces, on animals. Not that it is within the remit of this podcast to provide a full explanation of the Great Leap and everything that happened in it, but even the full picture for whomever would like to retell it, well, that may never be a fully realized thing. Historians must make do with the information that has become available, and much of it still remains under wrap, deep in party archives. But if we were to wrap up the Great Leap itself, well, as I lead into how it does end up winding down, I think it may be useful to just generally talk about what it was. How it was an endeavour so fundamentally rooted in the promise of communism, indeed the promise of utopia, that through this political energy a whole people could stand up and propel themselves to the end of history. Whatever the cost may be, the individual became little more than livestock in this planned economy, a resource to be used like any other resource. And in a system where reality was intentionally avoided in favour of promoting a sense of progress even in the face of disaster. The system set up by the Chinese Communist Party leadership, and Mao in particular, for the way he had manipulated that leadership to the point of being a supreme leader, well, it was just a terrible, terrible failure. As I've said multiple times throughout this very long episode, it was perhaps the worst human disaster of the 20th century and potentially ranking quite high in all of human history. The fact that the Great Leap continued in the face of someone like Peng Dehuai's criticism at Lushan in 1959, that is where we can really be quite skeptical of any attempt to obfuscate the leadership's role in the famine. They cannot hide behind the excuse that they had been lied to by their subordinates. They either willfully ignored the signs or were culpable in regards to their setting up a system that could be so easily subverted through lies in the first place. Or in fact, a system that made their subordinates feel that they had to lie in order to survive. And this, in the end, rests on Mao's shoulders. But before I get to how it ended in early 1962, for those of you familiar with the story of the Khmer Rouge that this podcast aims to fully explain, even though we've spent 3 hours in China, forgive me, how much of this sounded similar? Massive collectivization, huge labour and agricultural projects, overwork, famine, killings, the disintegration of the family unit, even the disuse of money in many places. Well, I've come to think of the Great Leap Forward as a kind of program that a revolutionary country might try and run. That program might run differently on different kinds of operating systems, if you follow the analogy. But it's no coincidence that the most often heard slogan throughout the Khmer Rouge era was, "With the Angkar, we shall make a great leap forward, a prodigious great leap forward." The Khmer Rouge may not have been aware of just how badly the Great Leap Forward had failed. The Chinese Communist Party will not have admitted this in the time before the Khmer Rouge came to power, but in the words of the historian Henri Lachlan, in the eyes of the Khmer revolutionaries, any failure that the Great Leap might have had was not so much to do with the program itself, but rather because the Chinese followers of Mao hadn't had the conviction to carry their radical views to the true logical end. Nor did they show the firmness in repressing all possible elements that might have got in their way. Basically, the Khmer Rouge thought that the Great Leap Forward hadn't gone far enough. But we will get to their part of the story in due course, my dear listener. Thus far we have discussed the circumstances around the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party, their initial attempts at socialist transformation, based principally off of the Soviet model. Something I can't help but relate to the idea of the recipe for some kind of complicated main course, like we did in a previous episode. It's like, oh, how are we going to make this dish? Well, we'll get that particular recipe book off of the shelf. It was, imagine it titled something like Implementing a Marxist-Leninist Society by the Soviet Union of Socialist Republics, 3rd edition. And Mao, in particular, thought, cool, great recipe book, but you know what? I reckon we could make some adjustments here and there as well. Make some notes around the side, maybe add a little bit more of this, maybe change this one and put this one in the oven a bit longer. Then about halfway through assembling all of the ingredients and getting all the things in the oven, he thought, you know what? Actually, screw that recipe. Let's make our own. And it'll be done in half the time. And it'll make 12 times the amount. Anyway, initial signs were good that this great leap might work. Except that most of those good signs were either based on extremely short-term gains or were outright lies. Expectations rose so high that even when people started starving as a result, that was just blamed on people not trying hard enough. Let's raise the target some more. There were disastrous efforts to make more steel than Britain. Wars on nature that break the balance of ecosystems that further exacerbate the problems of the campaign. And utter delusional thinking from those at the helm of this regime that everything is actually going pretty well, and that anyone who says otherwise is some kind of deviationist from the cause, a heretic of sorts. So how does it all come to an end? Well, it is in 1960 that a kind of breaking point is reached. A report, actually a series of reports after one or another gets suppressed by various levels of the regime, afraid of what might happen if it did come to light, eventually comes to light. They detail the simply egregious death toll of a city in Hainan province called Xinjiang. Initially coming out in the minutes of a Central Committee Internal Affairs Department meeting, that said that somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people had died in this city. Another report comes out that there was 400,000 deaths. And then another, which said 600,000. This is at a time when tens of millions were starving across the nation, and certain state granaries that were bulging were remaining closed. Mao and his associates were well aware of the suffering for months and did nothing. But the Xinjiang incident finally broke through this bubble of unreality and prompted a retreat and change of policy across the board. Mao himself quickly places himself on the side of the victims, saying that, in 1/3 of the country the situation's bad. Scoundrels have taken power. People are getting beaten to death. Food production has dropped and people are starving. He's sort of placing the blame on lower levels of the system and pleading ignorance. And also, like I said, putting himself in the position of the people saying, look, it's been terrible for us. It's gone bad. Why hasn't anyone done anything? In January of 1961, the Central Committee approves adjustment, consolidation, replenishment, and enhancement. These are the words they used in the meeting. Some sort of, it's like business jargon, meaning essentially that they were abandoning the Great Leap Forward. Relief grain is sent to the worst affected areas. These massive collectives of people, the people's communes, were subdivided into smaller, more manageable, more humane units. The backyard steel program was ended. Family ownership of small garden plots, as well as domestic animals, was reintroduced. Rural markets were allowed to open, and families could again supplement their income with other occupations. By 1962, economic recovery began to creep back as the most dehumanizing aspects of the Great Leap were rescinded. And what of the Great Leader? Well, as Philip Short eloquently writes, quote, "As Mao contemplated the ruins that his delusions had brought about, he began gloomily to implement his long-delayed promise to retire to the so-called Second Front. The Great Leap had ended in an apocalyptic failure. His grandiose dream of universal plenty had metamorphosed into an epic of pure horror." End quote. I wish that we could say that was the end of the suffering that Mao would, to some extent, be responsible for, as it will not just be his legacy in the form of Maoism that will have a role to play in other violent conflicts around the globe during the Cold War, but in China itself he still will return in quite violent fashion with the Cultural Revolution by the end of the 1960s. And don't worry, my dear listener, we will briefly explain that in due course. We won't devote a whole episode to it, mind you. I hope that we may be done completely jumping away from the Cambodian story for, well, potentially the rest of this series. We'll see how we go, but there's a chance that we could spend some significant time on US foreign policy as well, and, the developments of the Vietnam War, but, remember, this is all part of that historical hurricane, folks. Anyway, I wanted to round out this particular episode by just fully fledging out the beginnings of the Sino-Soviet split, because, again, it's hard to stress just how important this is. China is important, Maoism is important, the Great Leap Forward is very important, and the Sino-Soviet split is incredibly important to the story of the Khmer Rouge. But I'm calling it the Sino-Soviet split. It should be referred to perhaps more as a rift at this point. It's not quite this, massive chasm between the two, where it's basically all-out conflict. By this time, just after the Great Leap Forward ends in 1962, it's very cool between the Russians and the Chinese. Like I said, things are going to get much worse between the two communist superpowers by the end of the 1960s, but the seeds are well and truly sown now. So I want to make clear what we are talking about, because it's one of the most important aspects of the Cold War. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned how the relationship between Stalin and the Chinese communists wasn't great. In fact, the Man of Steel had once remarked to a US diplomat during the Second World War, when they were still in contact, that the CCP were margarine. They were spurious. We talked about the personality clashes between Stalin and Mao, political and military strain on the relationship, and while Mao did take the opportunity to criticize Stalin in the wake of Khrushchev's secret speech, you'll remember he was careful to only criticize him in relation to mistakes he felt the former Soviet leader had made in relation to China. As Julia Lovell writes in her book about Maoism, quote, "But Mao was addicted to other aspects of the Stalinist project. For obvious reasons, he wanted to defend the need for personality cult. Following on from his formative readings of Stalin's brief course in the 1930s, he also retained a deep attachment for the tenets of revolutionary Stalinism of the 1920s. The belief that the population, especially the rural population, could be hectored and, where necessary, terrorized in generating the agrarian surpluses necessary to fund rapid industrial and, above all, military development." End quote. And it wasn't just, these core beliefs that could be gleaned from Stalin that Mao also felt needed protecting from Khrushchev's dismantling of some aspects of the Soviet system. Mao also felt that wider policy aims of the new Soviet leader, things like de-escalating the worldwide conflict with the US and other capitalist countries, this, peaceful coexistence, as opposed to, inevitable violent clash between socialist and capitalist societies. Mao deemed all of that as revisionist. That the break with Stalin was some kind of revisionism of the path as it had been laid out by the earlier communist prophets. Now, I really want to emphasize that because this label, revisionist, it will become such a part of the vernacular during the Cold War that it's kind of important to have a handle on. And again, my mind straight away goes to this place of seeing it, this word in these quasi-religious terms, like saying someone is an apostate, a heretic, a non-believer. It's like blasphemy, being a revisionist. Mao begins to see the Soviets as deviating from the path toward communism, and starts to place himself and the Chinese movement as the ideological head of the worldwide socialist cause. His slogan of continuous revolution was designed to distinguish what the Chinese were doing from the Soviets, implying that they had stalled and were going backward. He emphasized that all that was important in attaining communism was communist spirit. It had nothing to do with the material and economic reality of the country in question, something that the Khmer Rouge will be particularly drawn toward. Khrushchev and Mao will have a particularly fraught relationship. Even when the new Soviet leader had initially tried to be so welcoming and beneficial to the Chinese. There's an often recalled example of Mao, literally flexing on the Soviet leader as they met in China to discuss important matters. Mao was a famed swimmer. Khrushchev was anything but. Now, Mao makes the Soviet leader conduct the meeting in a swimming pool as he literally swims laps around him, while Khrushchev tries not to swallow too much water as he has inflatable floating armbands on like a 5-year-old. The intransigence of Mao was not confined to the swimming pool, however. On the international stage as well, the Chinese leader would denounce Soviet imperialism, stoke conflicts with India and the US that caused the Soviets a lot of problems. Again, recall that quote from Mao about half the world dying in a nuclear holocaust, and that kind of being okay because there would still be enough Chinese communists to repopulate the earth. That kind of attitude on the international stage is wild. All of this doesn't go unnoticed, and eventually, in response, all of the thousands of Soviet advisors that had been sent to China as part of Khrushchev's initial attempts to help the new People's Republic stand up, they're recalled at once in July 1960. And as you'll recall, that's kind of smack bang in the middle of the Great Leap. This is a big moment in the Sino-Soviet split, like the official point where it became at least an official rift. Not only did the Soviet advisors leave, but you can bet that Khrushchev also reneged on giving the Chinese an atom bomb as he had originally pledged. And this all didn't go unnoticed, and it had effects that would also take their toll on the Great Leap itself. Like, the Chinese kind of had this attitude once the advisors were recalled and the atom bomb kept. The Chinese leadership, particularly under Mao, was saying, "You think we need your help anymore? That debt we owe you? We're going to pay that back in no time. It's nothing. And hey, you know what, the rest of the world, if you need anything, you need food, money, you come to us. If you need. We're doing super duper well over here." The Sino-Soviet split, even at this early point, has an impact, as I said, on the Great Leap. As I mentioned before, that whole ramping up of the Great Leap forward, keeping exports really super high, requisitioning all grain available, that was in part done to pay off debts quicker than originally planned, as well as picking up this mantle of being the world's food bank. All of this is kind of done to ingratiate the People's Republic to the world as the new head of the socialist movement, even though things were going so badly behind the scenes. It's something like an ideological pissing match, and it causes the Chinese people a lot of problems. But at this stage, this rift, this split between the Soviets and the Chinese, it's more about, name calling. It's all talk. But it will lead to historical circumstances that both exacerbate parts of the Cold War, as well as arguably lead to its conclusion. But importantly, the Cold War had kind of grown this new appendage, this new kind of path that movements around the globe might look to take. Before it was, it was a split between capitalist or communist. Now it's capitalist or Soviet communist or Chinese communist. And whether foreign policy advisors and war planners in the US are able to see that split will also become quite important. And we've also now got Maoism itself. This will be an extremely important export of the Chinese during the Cold War. They want to take the position as leaders of the communist world, and they will offer the kind of ideology that leads to something like the Great Leap Forward to all that will take it, while hiding from those same people, and largely from themselves, the terrible consequences of that attempted leap into communism. In 1965, Minister of Defense Lin Biao actively encouraged the global export of Maoist revolution in his puff piece, "Long live the victory of the People's War." I'll quote from it here. "Mao Zedong's thought is a common asset of the revolutionary people of the whole world. This is the great international significance of the thought of Mao Zedong. Hold aloft the just banner of people's war. Victory will certainly go to the people of the world." End quote. I feel like there will not be another part of the world that sees this interplay between ideological factionalism, East versus West, nationalism versus imperialism, nationalism versus nationalism, than in Indochina after the Second World War. In the next episode, we will see all of these elements of the historical hurricane once again pick up speed as the region begins to descend back into armed struggle, with those international and domestic players all seeking to stake a claim on what will become one of the most infamous proxy wars of the Cold War. A war which Cambodia, apparently thriving on the surface but with an undercurrent of dissatisfaction and a revolutionary movement of its own, will soon be dragged into